Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Smith. It's great to see you here at the second year of Conversations at FAS. It's a wonderful platform that we've put together to allow faculty to come and speak about important issues, have conversations. I encourage you as we go through this to prepare questions to ask for the audience or statements that you would like to make. We're here to explore big topics, both in the areas of research as well as teaching and learning. So this year, we have the honor of being a signature event for the 375th anniversary of Harvard College and the university. Opportunity for us to look back on the proud history of this institution, but also an opportunity for us to look forward and think about where we want to go in the future, just as you will see with today's panel. Our panel is not only very much in this mode, but it is a panel of what I like to think of as young superstars on our faculty, individuals that will certainly be leaders for us in the future. They're here to give us some of their thoughts about what the future looks like for institutions like ours, as well as issues in the areas of education. So the panels, I should also mention, if you don't mind briefly, this year's panels will also be followed next year by a set of panels. We're already organizing panels for next year. They will be focusing on the digital revolution in teaching. Peter Bohl and Gary King have been kind enough to agree to be organizers for these panels. If you have any interest in this area, I certainly encourage you to reach out to both Peter and Gary and talk to them about your interests and see if you want to get involved. This year, the panels are not only going to be moderated by Maya Jasanoff, but I have to also thank her for her incredible efforts in bringing together the topics that we will hear about both at this panel as well as the next one. She has been an incredible enthusiast about this, a ringleader to help bring the faculty together, and I think has put together a program that you will find to be quite exciting. Before she introduces the panelists and frames today's discussion, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction of her. She is a professor of history for us. Her teaching and research have focused on the history of modern Britain and the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her first book, Edge of Empire, Lives, Culture, and Conquest in the East, 1750 to 1850, investigates the British expansion in India and Egypt through the lives of art collectors. It was awarded the 2005 Duff Cooper Prize and was a Book of the Year selection in numerous British publications, including The Economist, The Observer, and The Sunday Times. Her recent book, Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, to be published just this past year, provides the first global history of loyalists who fled the United States after the American Revolution and resettled in Canada, the Caribbean, Britain, Sierra Leone, and beyond. So thank you again to Maya and our panelists for their time and their efforts today, and thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed today's program. Thank you.
Well, let me thank Mike for those introductory remarks. Also, let me thank Nina Collins and Meg Casey, who have done a great job in helping to bring these events together, and we will all have occasion to thank the panelists, who I will introduce in a moment. Now, as a historian, I believe that you can sometimes get the best views of the future by taking a couple of steps back. So let me take a couple of steps back into my own history at Harvard when I arrived as a freshman 20 years ago this fall. We, at that time, pored over the Facebook in our dorm rooms, hard copy, of course. We made social plans by calling our friends on phones that were plugged into walls. We even, once in a while, engaged with the outside world by flipping through the pages of newspapers over our meals. Almost nobody did email. In fact, I was the only person I knew as a freshman who did any email at all. There were no iPhones, no iPads, no iPods, no iSites, no anything. There was no Google, there was no YouTube, there was no Wikipedia, there was no Skype, Twitter, blogs, no online journals, no PowerPoint. We had no meals in Annenberg. We had no anything in CGIS, which of course didn't exist then. We had no Gen Ed, no winter session, no Rockefeller grants to see the world. Now, Harvard at 375, of course, is a very different place, and it's sitting in a very different world. We're living through a revolution, a digital revolution, that in ways both great and small has been transforming the ways that we live and we work. It's become a commonplace that we're more wired, or for that matter now, more wireless than ever before, more internationally connected, that we have access to more information, and that more of us have access to information than ever before. In the words of a best-selling author, this is an age preeminently distinguished for the facilities which it affords for human intercourse and the spread of knowledge. In traveling and communications, it surpasses every other. And as we look on, we are accustomed to congratulate ourselves upon the marvelous progress of the age. Now, I draw that quote from Samuel Smiles, the author of the runaway international bestseller Self-Help, which was published in 1859. So we're not the first to feel awestruck at the remarkable potential of the age. Our digital revolution echoes the Industrial Revolution, to which Smiles was directly responding. And we're not the first to wonder what its potential might be. It still remains to be seen, Smiles continued, whether the vast amount of printed matter in circulation is calculated to produce wiser and better men, actuated by higher and more benevolent principles of action than existed in times comparatively remote, in which books were far rarer but much more highly prized. And if you substitute access for knowledge for Smiles's books, the same still obtains. So change, for many of us, spells magnificent opportunity. Just think of all the new things we can do. But it also makes us take stock of our values and our goals. What can get lost along the way? This year's conversations at FAS have a simple goal: to reflect together on what the freshmen entering Harvard in 2036, 37, the year of this university's 400th anniversary, might seek and gain from their experience here. To consider how FAS scholars might teach them, might perform and present our research, and to consider how the FAS itself might best accommodate the transformative possibilities of our age. In short, how is the digital revolution changing what we do as scholars and teachers, and how might we respond? So we're going to approach a set of connected questions in two parts. On March 7th at 4 p.m., we're going to reconvene in this room with Claudine Gay, Matthew Knock, Parimal Patel, and Rob Wood to consider broadly what aspects of Harvard's 370 years to date we might wish to keep with us as we move forward to 400. But today, we're going to let the futurologist fantasies run wild. What can we do with exponentially increasing quantities of data? How should universities allocate their resources? How to handle it? How does vastly widened access to knowledge change scholars' relationship to discovery and interpretation, and also their practices in the classroom? To address these questions, let me introduce to you some of the people who will get us there. And I can tell you right away that the Harvard at 400 will be dressed in lavender. David Charbonneau, professor of astronomy at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Dave Charbonneau was a Discover Magazine Scientist of the Year, winner of the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal, and National Science Foundation's Alan T. Waterman Award. Dave's mission is to detect exoplanets, distant planets orbiting other sun-like stars, and this makes him especially well-placed to talk to us about the new world of data collection available. Ann Pearson, Professor of Biogeochemistry from the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Ann is a recent Radcliffe Institute Fellow. She's also David and Lucille Packard Foundation Fellow for Science and Engineering. And Ann has been described as a chemical sleuth, detecting the nature of environments from millions of years ago using the chemical clues that they have left behind. And Ann will talk to us about the advanced instrumentation that makes this and other work possible. Martin Puchner, Byron and Anita Wien Professor of Drama and English and Comparative Literature. Martin is a prolific author of books, including The Poetry of the Revolution, Marx, Manifestos and the Avant-Garde, published in 2006. He's also author of The Drama of Ideas, Platonic Provocations in Theater and Philosophy, 2010. Martin has most recently been engaged as general editor of the Norton, multi-volume Norton Anthology of World Literature. So he'll be speaking to us about the role of scholars as interpreters in the digital and global information landscape. Finally, Hopi Hoekstra, Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and also in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology. Hopi is also Curator of Mammals at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. That's a title that just is a great one, Curator of Mammals. Hopi is an evolutionary biologist, and she works on adaptation and speciation among vertebrates, particularly mice, and I urge you to look at her lab group photo, which is either cute or frightening, depending on what you think of mice. Her lab adopts an interdisciplinary approach ranging from molecular techniques, population genetics, through to field-based experiments, and this positions her very well to talk to us about new ways that we're teaching today and tomorrow. So I will now hand it over to the great team to lead you through these topics.
Well, good. So I'm Dave Charbonneau, and I'm from the future. And what I want to do is, I think my task here was to really talk about the challenges and the opportunities that are going to be presented by this exponential increase in data and the different ways that we're going to collect data. And I'm going to draw examples from what I do, which is to look for planets around other stars. But that's really just to give you some cause to think about your own work and to get our discussion going in the bottom half of this session, okay? Okay, so what do? So I build robotic telescopes, and this is a movie, it's a time-lapse movie of those robotic telescopes. As the sun sets, the roof of the building is going to move out of the way. These telescopes are on a distant mountaintop in Arizona. I can view them with my iPhone once the sun is set there. And you don't see it very well here because the lights are on, but you can see that the stars are passing overhead. And the point is that the data gathering here is totally automated. Okay, so we have a robotic observatory. It's going to generate a very large data volume. It's going to generate maybe 10 or 20 gigabytes a night. And I have students that come and join this project after all of that thinking is over and done, and the infrastructure to generate the data is in place. What do those students do? Well, what those students do is they find the planets, okay? So let me give you the name of one such student, and his name is Zachary Berta. Zachary is a fourth-year graduate student, and using data from this array of telescopes, what we call the Mirth array, where we're looking for these small and potentially Earth-like planets, Zach discovered the first planet, and it was big news. It was front page in the New York Times. It was the first nearby water world. And part of what was so exciting is that it was extremely close to us, and so we were able to go ahead and study its atmosphere with resources like the Hubble Space Telescope, and so we could really figure out what the chemistry of that atmosphere would be. Okay, exciting stuff. How did we train Zach to do that work? Okay, so here's Zach's, I went through Zach's transcripts. He got an extensive education in analytic physics, in lots of knowledge in stellar astrophysics, cosmology, galactic astronomy, a very, very high-level, proof-focused mathematical education. And so really, we did a great job. And I'm not talking about Harvard. I'm talking about his undergraduate institution as well as the education we gave him here on basically an astronomical knowledge, a lot of knowledge, theoretical physics and analytic techniques, and not surprisingly, it's exactly how I was educated. And it was exactly how my advisor was educated. Okay, so what skills did Zach use to make this landmark discovery in our group? None of those skills. Okay, what Zach did, I think, uniquely, I think that other people couldn't do this, and so Zach deserves recognition for this, was to really develop innovative, advanced data management and data visualization skills. He's going to get a PhD in astronomy, but most of his focus is on that. He had some remarkably sophisticated techniques for searching for essentially a needle in a haystack, and these incredibly rare, weak signals. What happens is we generate millions of light curves. We measure the brightnesses of stars night after night after night for years, and Zach has to find the one star in that database of thousands of stars that's showing this little periodic eclipse because a planet is orbiting that star and not the other 2,000 stars in the sample. There was an immensely complicated data set. There was lots of confounding factors. As clouds go overhead, some stars vary intrinsically in brightness. And he had to have the ability not only to analyze the existing data, but to interact with the observatory. That basically the observatory changes what it's doing in real time based on inputs from him about where to put priorities. Okay? So arguably, it could have been done by someone who had many of Zach's talents, and these are talents he developed here at Harvard, but who actually had never taken a single course in physics or astronomy. And this is the first point I want to make. I think this is not uncommon in the sciences, at least, where we have this kind of unease, where we teach students one way, and we certainly want them to know all that stuff, but how they really distinguish themselves and advance through academia is actually because of some other set of skills. Looking ahead to the sort of data volumes we're talking about, I just want to bring up one future project. This is a funded project. It is moving ahead. It is called the Largescale Synoptic Survey. And what it will do, this is a picture of the Andes in Chile at the site where this telescope will be located. It's primarily funded by the National Science Foundation, but there are dozens of academic partners, as well as partners like Google Inc. And what this observatory will do when it goes online in about 10 years is it will meticulously survey the night sky every night, looking for new things, looking for things that you would never detect by eye. These can be periodic phenomena like planets going in front of their stars, but they, more excitingly perhaps, will be just phenomena that we have never even considered. That's how many discoveries are made in astrophysics, and that'll lead us to a deeper understanding of the physical universe. And just to give you a scale for the sort of data we're talking about, okay, so every 15 seconds, this telescope will snap an image with its 3 gigapixel camera. So if you wanted to look at that image, okay, and not lose any information, you would need, if you took one of these computer monitors, you would need an array of 40 by 40 such monitors, just so that you would see all the individual pixels. You see what I'm saying? The camera covers so much of the sky that if you display it on some sort of device that we're used to, you lose most of the information. And that happens every 15 seconds. So the sustained data rate is several gigabytes a minute. Now, if I take the average PhD thesis and I digitize the text, I don't lose any of the information, that's about 1 megabyte. Okay, so every 10 or 20 seconds, this observatory is generating 1,000 times more data volume. And the 10-year archive will be 15 petabytes. Okay, so that would be equivalent to 600 million filing cabinets, okay, of those graduate student theses. Okay, so that's what we have to prepare for. We're part of this, right? Many professors here at Harvard are very involved in this. Many of our students, this will be one of the leading observatories. The National Science Foundation is doing this. Now, if you're in most departments, and I'm included here, you're just astounded by this data volume. But if you're in one of a few different departments, probably computer science, you're not astounded by that data volume. Okay? You know that the data, the computer resources that will be required by this project, 15 petabytes, those computers won't even rank in the top 500 most powerful computing systems at the time that this starts operation in a decade. Okay? because Google and Bank of America and all these other non-academic partners are dealing with much, much larger and more impressive data sets, okay? And so what relationship do we have with that action if most of that action is happening outside of academia? I also want to mention the use of crowdsourcing. So one activity that I'm involved in is to help build a spacecraft called the TESS satellite. We're proposing this to NASA, and the idea is to find the very closest planets to us because those are the ones we can study with observatories and actually look if the chemical signatures of life are present in the atmosphere. So this is how we're actually going to go and find life in the universe and answer if we're alone. Big question. I'm going to work for 10 years on this. NASA's going to invest $200 million if we get selected. A lot of other folks will be involved. The data go public immediately, and I will probably not be a co-author on the discovery paper. Okay? So that's another feature of the future, is that we seem to be willing to work on entirely public service data sets, where someone will then take that nicely pre-assembled data set that someone spent 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars generating, they'll pick up that data set and they'll write a discovery paper. And if they do their job, there'll be an acknowledgement to us. Okay? And there's no hard feelings, but that's, so the point is, what is research? How do we give credit, intellectual credit for ideas, and how do we participate in these enormous collaborations that will involve hundreds of PhD scientists? And this gives rise to the term, in fact, of data mining, which is something you're hearing increasingly in some scientific disciplines, where you'll have an entire PhD thesis or even an entire career built on simply being better. What is it to be a data miner? I guess it's that you're better or more efficient or more innovative in the ways that you troll through existing data sets that you yourselves don't generate and you don't control the production of. Also, in terms of data, I want to point to the literature databases. Okay, so in astronomy, even 15 years ago, essentially every single article ever written in astronomy and physics was combined into a single archive that was word searchable. Okay, and that's 15 years ago. Okay, and so now what we're doing with, and it's called the Astrophysics Data System. It's funded by NASA, but it's actually here. It's here at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. I mean, not in this auditorium, but a 10-minute walk away, okay? And the point here is that what we're doing now, what many groups are doing, and I'm pointing to Professor Alyssa Goodman's work with ADS Labs, is of course you can very efficiently search for a term. So you could, for example, take the word biosignatures, which is a code name for life on other planets, and then you can do that search, and then all of a sudden you'll see, here are all the different references that come up. But then you can do much more, right? You can then do semantic literature searching. And so you can identify the articles that the system thinks are most relevant to what you're really meant to find. Or you can ask, what would be a good introduction to some topic that I'm not aware of? But you can go further and say, let me take this author. Which paper would they recommend based on the papers they themselves refer to at different points in their publication? Or you can go even further. You can look at the networks of authorship. So this panel here, okay, that shows the names of all the individuals who came up in this search and their interactions based on their citations. And what do you see? You see islands, right? You can see that there are clear, large centers of activity that have not a single connection between them. And so right away, what this would do is someone knows how to mine this system of data. In this case, it's a literature database. Then they would immediately know how to connect to groups and have access to information between groups that are not currently collaborating. We also are connecting this to an online database of the sky, of the actual visual sky. So the point is, when you do a search on biosignatures, it displays this format on a map of the sky and tells you which stars and which sources and which galaxies it's referring to. Okay? I know that DASH is something that Harvard is very proud of, and rightly so. I want to point out that in the physical sciences, we're now at the 20th anniversary of the International Free Archive of essentially all papers. And this is not published papers. These are typically papers before submission to a refereeing process. And so they get input from the community. And this is the number of monthly submissions to this archive. These are papers in the physical sciences, physics, and astronomy primarily. Okay, and so you can see that right now there's about 7,000 submissions per month. This is not cumulative. Okay, 7,000 new submissions per month. Okay. And so I want to point out that, in terms of thinking about DASH and the role of this kind of open scholarship, there is this model which has been very vibrant for 20 years, and it has a very interesting relationship with the peer review process because, of course, most of these authors are actually seeking input before they finalize their manuscript. Okay, and the last point I want to make, which is a real concern I have, is, here's just typical author lists for papers that I work on. Okay? And that's because you have, these are papers from the Kepler mission. That's a $600 million activity. There might be 100 PhDs involved. And then a graduate student comes along and makes an important intellectual contribution to the discovery of the first Earth-sized planets. Harvard led that discovery. The first author there is Francois Fressin. He's my postdoc. This was a big deal. This was a landmark discovery in exoplanets. But another important contributor who didn't lead the effort was Courtney Dressing. There she is. How do we give credit for Courtney's participation in this discovery? We have one mechanism, which is reference letters, right? But I think that will only get us so far as we start to see author lists. And in particle physics, you can have author lists that are even much larger, hundreds of authors. Okay, and so how does this very large author list interact with the priority that we give in academia for individual achievement? Okay, and so just to hand off, these are the questions that I was really thinking about and that I hope we might discuss today. How do we deal with the sheer volume of data, particularly when most of the action is outside academia? Are we okay with teaching students to be better at accessing and processing data, but less knowledgeable? How best might we use the large literature databases to do the sorts of innovative connections I was talking about? And then how do we balance the drive, which is really data-driven, to these immense collaborations? How do we balance that with the things that we really value in academia, which is asking, what did this person contribute? And what promise do they have for the future? Okay? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Ann Pearson, and I'm in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And it was my task today to come and speak to you a little bit about the challenges facing us as we go forward dealing with advances in instrumentation, and specifically the pace of change. Now, Dave and I did not coordinate in advance, but in many respects, what I'm going to say parallels very nicely with what he's just said. It's just that we're going to step back from the very, very large scale, large infrastructure, big budget projects, and down to the level of the individual investigator who runs a lab that is largely independent and is not based on $600 million telescopes. But you will be basically, I'll try to communicate to you that effectively a lot of the issues that we face are largely the same. Okay, so I am a chemist, and most of the work that I do analytically is in the area of mass spectrometry. Now, if most of you are not familiar with that, that's okay. But basically, I wanted to start by showing a little nice picture of historical instruments through time. The nice, shiny, fancy, big white ones here are new ones. These old ones here are on the order of 30 to 40 years old. And this gives you an idea of how many times one particular company has updated, upgraded its instrumentation offerings just over basically the span of my lifetime. Now, I want to go and use a specific example to talk about this and talk about the pace of advancement in instrumentation. And the example I'm going to use, unfortunately, please forgive me, comes from our colleagues at Yale. And they published a major advancement in analytical mass spectrometry around about 1986, 1987 or so, 89, I guess it says over here. And the advancement was the development of something known as an electrospray interface. And this enabled the analysis of very large biomolecules and really permitted advances in proteomics. And now if you go to biology and chemistry labs, you will see that everyone is doing proteomics. It's the latest and greatest thing. The ability to do that did not exist 25 years ago. So it's all just happened. And what that means effectively is that this was not part of my training. It was not something I could have walked in the door and known how to do. These are all things that we have to continually educate ourselves about as we go through our careers. What is amazing about this example is that here is their state-of-the-art mass spectrum published at that time. This was absolutely top-notch in 1989. This is mass spectrum of protein cytochrome C. It was obtained on a mass spectrometer that has some various parameters here that you don't need to understand, but just sort of use as reference numbers. The ion detectability of this mass spectrometer is 1500. That's the largest ion that it can detect. The resolution, or the distance between peaks, basically is this number 300. Today, you can go out and buy a mass spectrometer like this to do electrospray and look at proteins and obtain a mass spectrum of the same protein, cytochrome C, where the black smooth curve on the outside is approximately the resolution they would have obtained with that old instrument. And the red peaks in here are the ones that we could obtain with a modern day instrument. Now, what's interesting about this is that it represents an achievement in increasing the ion detectability up to 2,000 from the original approximately 1,500, and the mass resolution that had previously been in the low hundreds is now in the multiple tens of thousands. And so this represents about 25 years or so of progress in the field of mass spectrometry. But my favorite part of this is that I own one of these, purchased it about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. It's in my lab. This is my instrument room. This is only about 2/3 of my instrument room. I can't get it all in the picture. And can you see where this instrument is in there? Anybody can see it? No, right? Because it's way over here in the corner, and it's one of only about 6 things that you see in this picture. And so it represents something that in the last 25 years has gone from something that has improved by several-fold in its analytical ability and has decreased by several-fold in its accessibility. And when I purchased mine, the reason why I was able to acquire it is because it was already used, that was being resold, and it was obsolete. So here is my very fancy and very obsolete instrument over in the corner. And that really represents an idea of the pace of change in just one particular small subset of one larger field of chemistry. So what I want to do is I want to go through 3 similar narratives of the kinds of change that we're facing when we're talking about doing analytical chemistry. And so basically the idea is I thought, starting from today, and we're supposed to project 25 years in the future, could I find more examples like this from approximately 25 years ago? How far have we come in the last 25 years to get an idea of the amount of change in that time? I also was getting a little overwhelmed by examples, so I decided that the examples that I'm going to draw from are all related to what we would call minor instrumentation. Minor instrumentation, by my definition, would be anything that costs less than $2 million. Okay? Now, given Dave's example of $600 million, I feel really justified in using this as a threshold. $2 million sounds very minor in comparison. And so I want to look at some of where we were and then where we're going. Now, unfortunately, the very first example I found immediately violated my goal of going back only 25 years, but I could not resist putting this up. This is an original advertisement for the very first commercially available UV-vis absorption spectrophotometer that you could put in your laboratory. This was first marketed in 1941. Now, anybody who is a scientist who's done some of this work knows that to buy a basic spectrophotometer for the lab is so routine that you don't even think about it. In fact, we generally expect that our undergraduates arrive at Harvard already having used one of these in high school. This instrument, when it was offered for sale in 1941, if you take the price tag on it then and extrapolate forward to $2012, cost a little over $10,000. And the way it took a spectrum was you dialed the wavelength by hand, waited for the instrument to stabilize, plotted the absorbance at that wavelength, and then redialed to the new wavelength and did it again. And so every single datum was collected individually and written down, and from that, one would generate a spectrum. That's really pretty incredible. The way you do it today is you open up a catalog, have a choice of 10 different instruments, plunk down some number that's significantly less than $10,000, and generate data for each sample in certainly under 30 seconds. And so this represents what I call an example of narrative 1 regarding instruments. The first narrative regarding an instrument is that as the technology progresses, it gets so unbelievably easy and inexpensive that everybody is expected to have one, because there is no reason not to have something that would be so simple, other than the fact that there are now dozens and dozens of different pieces of individual instrumentation that every lab is expected to acquire under this particular paradigm. And so suddenly I have to buy 15 different $7,000 instruments. And there are more and more instruments that come into this category every year. And so therefore the expectation of purchasing increases every year as this trend goes forward. The next example is an example of what we would call the second narrative. The second narrative is one in which the instrumental technology improves so quickly, and the pace of the quality and the amount of data generated increases so rapidly that the expense of the instrument actually goes up with time. And so the classic example of this is DNA sequencing. The first commercial DNA sequencer that was ever marketed was the Applied Biosystems 370. The Applied Biosystems 370 was a slab gel reader, for those of you who know what that is. And you could sequence, I think it was 12 or 16 samples simultaneously in an overnight sequencing run. So it was an all-day process to set up, run, and then take down. And the total amount of data generated per day was about 5,000 bases, or 5,000 DNA nucleotides. Cost of this was somewhere in the 100,000s. I was not able to get an actual accurate number for it. I was talking to somebody at NIH, and this was their best estimate. Today, if you want to buy a state-of-the-art sequencer, the latest and greatest one is the Illumina HiSeq 2000, and the rate of data generation in the HiSeq 2000 is 25 billion base pairs per day. And the cost of that instrument is somewhere just south of $700,000. And so the capacity is going up at the rate of some of the examples like what Dave said, billions and billions of data points every single day in these instruments. But the cost to get it is also going up. And the expectation is that every lab would have access to one of these in order to keep up with the times. And so this, in many ways, is a very pressing responsibility on us as individuals and on us as a university. In the ability of us to keep up with technology and keep up with the times, we need to ensure that our investigators have access to the pace of change. And as an individual, it becomes then prohibitive to consider buying one of these instruments because next year it will be obsolete also. And next year's instrument may be twice as fast. And the year after that, twice again. We really don't know. Okay, the last example very quickly is something that is right on this borderline or threshold of what we would call major instrumentation, but this still would qualify as minor instrumentation. And the third narrative of instrumentation actually is this unique or exclusivity argument. If I can have one and nobody else has one, then I have an advantage. And there is much to be said for trying to outcompete one's colleagues at other universities or in other countries by trying to be the people who get the new things before the other people get them. And this is a race that is a little bit like leapfrog. And so somebody leapfrogs somebody else, and they continue, and it becomes a battle of acquiring bigger and better things. And so at some point, we need to think about strategies to overcome this desire to buy the newest and the best. So my example of multi-authorship that I was going to transition to is actually much less impressive than Dave's. And so I don't know that I want to spend very much time on this because he covered the issues I was going to bring up. But the question returns to this the same issue, which is when you have a multi-collaborator paper, who gets the credit for it and who's responsible for it, and how does this get divided among the various groups that contribute? One of the reasons for having multi-investigator groups that contribute to large projects like this is actually the second part of the authorship breakdown that I actually thought that I would add on in addition to the number of individuals and institutions. The breakdown of who owns which instrument and how much it would have cost. And so among these various groups that were from the USA and Germany, and I believe there should have been a third group on that paper. There's a Japanese group that was working on that same project, but a little bit like Dave's example, they're not actually on the paper, and I'm not sure why. But these various groups own a variety of expensive instruments, and somebody did sequencing, and I don't know how much that would have cost, and somebody took them all to sea on a field expedition to get the samples in the first place. The cost of going to sea is about $35,000 per day, and the typical length of a cruise is at least a month. And so if you go and you add up the bills and the price tags on various papers like this, you realize that there is very, very much in terms of financial and personal investment that goes into all of these projects. But in the end, we have a hard time deciding which of the 4 first authors who are all graduate students on this paper gets to include this paper in his or her thesis. And so this does become a real question of training and authorship as faces our students going forward. Okay, So one of the strategies to deal with the pressures to acquire ever more instrumentation is the creation of core facilities and centers. And core facilities and centers are wonderful, and there is a trend already towards doing more and more of this, and it's a wonderful idea. But it does come with some challenges and hurdles that we need to overcome. And one of them is what we call these sort of triangle relationships of responsibility. And so somebody has an investment in ownership of this facility, because the people who receive the priority are going to be generating funding, and when they generate funding, they are responsible for the facility, and once they are responsible and have funded the facility, they feel as though they should receive yet more priority. And this becomes a real issue when we think about who administers, who finances, and then who gets to reap the rewards of multi-user facilities. And so this is just something I hope that we can bring up a little bit in discussion. The other issue is then what is the resulting access to that facility? If somebody's financial investment is quite high, that person then has more students, more data, more papers, and more communication of the results and the resources from the facility, which acts as a positive feedback to bring in more people from that subdiscipline. Until soon, the facility is mostly serving one particular subdiscipline, and maybe other subdisciplines don't really know that it exists. And so these are other sets of questions that I think maybe it would be nice to discuss a little bit. So finally, just to end, some challenges for the next 25 years is really that the age of interdisciplinary work is already upon us. This is something that we're already dealing with in terms of challenge. And what we want to do is think about how we continue to fund that administratively and across departments, how that affects how we train our students, and whether we need to consider both intra-institutional and inter-institutional boundaries as we come to set up some of these things in the future. So with that, I think I will end and pass it off to the next.
Okay, my name is Mark OMara. I teach in the Department of English, and I'm also affiliated with comparative literature and the Committee on Dramatics. As everyone knows, it's a fool's errand to predict the future, but since I know it's fun to watch fools on stage, I'm happy to participate in this endeavor and consider this a kind of comedy of ideas. The comedy of ideas is one of the genres that I work on and that I will, in fact, come back to. So let me start this comedy of ideas with the first foolish prediction that has to do with the way in which this digital revolution that we are living through and that the other speakers have talked about is affecting the humanities, because it is affecting the humanities, though only slowly. And I was going to give you an example from my own work, a kind of before and after, to show you how that works. So in about 2000, I started to work on a project on political and artistic manifestos to explain why that period in the late 19th and early 20th century witnessed an explosion of such manifestos. And it quickly became clear to me that the key to the project was the Communist Manifesto, and so I started to look into the distribution, the first slow and then very rapid worldwide circulation of the Communist Manifesto, the translations, editions, and so on and so forth of that text. I started to look into that, and it quickly became clear that there was no way I was able to do that on my own. And because the humanities are severely underfunded, and I'm not looking at anyone in particular here, I was just about to give up because it became clear I would need dozens of researchers in many countries to really do that kind of global work, until I found by sheer coincidence in an obscure corner of Widener a small book published and put together and funded by an Italian communist publisher who had done precisely this kind of work in the 70s. And I was then able to plug that raw data into my research and chart the distribution and translations and attempted editions and so forth of the Communist Manifesto in a kind of quantitative way. So this was the kind of work that I would have been unable to do before searchable databases, before Google Books. The only reason why I was able to do that was because someone else had funded this project and done it. So fast forward to about 5 years, in 2005, I started a different project on the relation between philosophy and theater. And here the foundational key texts were Plato's dialogues. Plato, the foundational philosopher, who also writes in the dramatic form. Plato's dialogues became a kind of point of departure for this project, the way the Communist Manifesto had been for the previous one. I started to look around and stumbled upon a few plays that revolved around Socrates as the main character, and became clear that these playwrights had read Plato as a dramatist who had invented this character, this philosophical character, Plato, and had followed suit. I became very interested in this and searched around in the old way, in libraries, on microfiche displays, and found half a dozen additional of these very obscure plays, till it became clear that I had kind of stumbled on an undiscovered genre, the Socrates play, that combined in a very intriguing way theater and philosophy. And this is where I was when I turned to the then newly available Google Books and other searchable databases. And with relative ease, I was able to, by the end of by the time I had finished the process in 2008, I was able to find over 100 of these extremely obscure plays, and was able to kind of chart their progress. So this is something I would not have been able to do earlier. This is something that searchable databases allowed me and other researchers in the humanities to do. So this is sort of a first prediction that there is now for the humanities, for the first time, a kind of quantitative dimension that I think is starting to transform the way we in the humanities do research, and that will continue to transform our work in that way. A second prediction that answers to a different term, not digital humanities, which is sort of the rubric for this kind of work, but world literature. There's a resurgent interest in the humanities and world literature, and that's a process driven by a number of dynamics and a lot of fundamental thinking about what a basic humanities education should consist of today. Interest in educating students to be global citizens and for global marketplace. A recognition that contemporary literature is increasingly written for a single global marketplace, and other such processes. My own relationship to this field of research and teaching is when I became, as Maya mentioned, the general editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, a 6-volume doorstopper that's just going to be out in about 2 weeks, and also included a large number of collaborators, hundreds of collaborators. What surprised me, but maybe shouldn't have surprised me, is that the main work, it turned out, that I as a general editor had to do was to educate specialists in how to relate to each other and how to plug their specialized knowledge into a larger structure called world literature. And so I spent a lot of time working with individual specialists in that way. And I think that more of that will happen in the future. It may even transform the way in which we organize literature departments in the university. And so I wonder whether in Harvard at FAS at 400, we will have national literature departments in the way we do now, or area studies departments, or whether there, in addition to that, there will be some larger structure called world literature that allows and in fact requires specialists to think more about the relation between the particular and the general. Now we will continue to need specialized knowledge, there's no doubt about that, but I think with the increasing importance of projects such as this, we need to structurally figure out, and in terms of education, figure out a better way to do this, just so that general editors such as myself have less work to do, perhaps. A third prediction, if you will, is that these two developments, digital humanities and world literature, I think are wonderful developments, and I identify myself with them. I think they are transforming literature and humanities research in ways that are fantastic, but they bring with them a danger, and one could describe this danger as abstraction. if digital humanities and world literature is the future, FAS at 400, it will mean that increasingly we will read texts through searchable keywords, or to move texts from their original national, local contexts into this more abstract realm of world literature. I think this will happen, but I also think that there will be a countervailing move to these processes, a recognition precisely that we need to restore these texts to their local embedded context. And here too, I can draw on my own work and instincts, because I'm right now at work on a project on travel and world literature that reads literature on location, that does quasi-field work, almost anthropological field work in the context in which certain texts emerged. And so I wonder whether there's a certain logic to this, my own personal researcher's instinct, precisely a reaction to these other two developments, digital humanities and world literature. So three trends: digital humanities, world literature, and a kind of return or countervailing move to local, to a kind of local embedded literature. And part of that, by the way, I think is a continuing importance of language learning, again, as a kind of countervailing move to, let's say, global English and Google Translate and such processes. So a mixed picture, two main trends, and a kind of reaction to those is what perhaps will happen to the humanities at FAS at 400. Thank you.
What I was asked to do is talk about what the Harvard classroom would look like in 25 years. And I have to say that two caveats. The first thing is that I feel like my only qualification in really talking about this is that I like to teach, and I do a lot of teaching. And the second thing, as Martin mentioned, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, and I'm maybe a little bit less willing to be foolish. And so I was a little shy about making predictions, but instead decided to raise a number of questions that I hope we can then continue on in terms of discussion, because I know that there are many of you, I can see people in the audience who I've served on committees with associated with teaching. So there's many people that have thought long and hard about some of these questions that I'm going to raise today, much more than I have. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to think about is the face of the Harvard classroom. And like Maya mentioned, she's a historian. She thinks in the past. Evolutionary biologists do the same thing. We study the past. So if we think about what the classroom looked like maybe even 10 years ago, in our great dreams, it looks something like this. Maybe it's more like this, but let's be optimistic. Students were ready with pens in hand, paper, and paying attention. The last few years, maybe our view as a lecturer on a classroom looks something more like this. You look at the back of maybe hundreds of laptops, a sea of laptops out there. If we think about the future, what's the next step? One prediction may be something like this, where we may not even be lecturing in the same way, in the same physical spaces that we've been lecturing over the last several decades. And part of it could be that a student's view of a lecture may look something more like this. They don't have to come to classrooms anymore. They can watch many of our lectures online. And so we're competing as lecturers, whether you get students to come sit in rooms that look like this, or they can sit at home in their pajamas looking at lectures like this whenever they want, which for a Harvard student probably means about 4 o'clock in the morning. So I think one thing that will be fun to discuss is this idea of what is the role of a lecture, and is a lecture really necessary? I think we can all agree that by not having lectures, we're going to lose something. But is there more to gain by changing the role of the lecture and changing the content in that lecture? Certainly another thing that's been changing over the years is the tools that we use as lecturers in lectures. So again, looking into the past, we started maybe with the chalkboard and a piece of chalk. Then we graduated to PowerPoint, which we could see today the pluses and minuses of that approach. Tablets have become very useful, has been a great aid in teaching. Of course, many of us use the clicker system. Here are students actively learning. And now we're looking into the future where we have systems that may be able to use facial recognition to try to understand how students are learning better. So maybe one cynical view of this is the idea that we're sort of in this arms race between students being more distracted, have more availability of material at their own time, on their own computers, with us trying to find more innovative ways to try to engage students in the lecture and bringing them into classes. But I think that a more optimistic view of these types of tools is the idea that these tools are also at the point where they're able to teach teachers to teach more effectively. So for example, as we all know, the clicker system, we can get feedback about how well we're conveying our ideas to the audience. And certainly, if these facial recognition type systems work, we can actually, in real time, when you're telling them, your favorite equation, so forth, and when they start making a face like this, you'll get feedback to know that you're not reaching them in the way that you'd like. I think another big question that's worth discussing is this one. How much information do we want to share? Many of our sister universities are making lectures publicly available. Anybody can watch them. So does Harvard want to make all of our lectures available such that anyone could get a Harvard education just online? But it's not just how we teach. I think another or equally important point is what we teach. So I'm an evolutionary geneticist, and when I was doing my PhD work, I spent most of my time doing things like this, working in a lab at the bench. But nowadays, when I go into my lab and look at my students, they're spending a lot of time doing this. That is, they're analyzing a lot of data and spending much less time gathering that data. And this raises a number of important questions. How do we train students, and how is that changing over time? So it's not just how we teach students, but it's the material and the skills that we teach them. And this is very similar to the point that David made. So what skills are becoming more important? And one thing that I feel strongly about, at least in our field of evolutionary genomics, with more data available, that is, knowledge is becoming freely available, it's becoming more and more important to teach students critical and creative thinking, because everybody has now equal access to data, and the real winners in the system are going to be the ones who are creative enough or think critically enough and ask innovative questions to use that data wisely. So these types of general questions, I think, are important to ask about the classroom setting, but they also are equally applicable to the ways we're thinking about writing textbooks. So how interactive are textbooks, our ability to go in and take molecules and move them around, giving students 3D experiences in e-textbooks. Hands-on research experience is becoming more important. Even the way we teach our graduate students in terms of lab meetings and journal clubs, as well as our interactions with colleagues, are changing because of technology. So I want to end just by giving you two very simple examples, low-tech examples about how technology has changed the way we do hands-on research experience with undergrads, as well as the journal clubs that we use to teach our graduate students. So I don't know how many of you have been to the Museum of Comparative Zoology. I encourage you all to go. One of my favorite rooms in the museum is this one here. It's called the Great Mammal Hall. And it's pretty much still the way that it was built in 1859, so it still has that sort of Victorian feel. And the spirit of the room is the idea that all orders of mammals are represented, and the order in which they're placed in the room represents something about the relationships of those species to one another. So with a group of undergraduates who I taught mammalogy to, for our final project, what we decided to do was to reassess the relationships of mammals in this room. Now, certainly over the last several decades, molecular tools have enabled us to learn more about relationships among species by sequencing DNA and comparing those DNA sequences to give us a sense of genetic similarity. because of new technology like the sequencers that Anne mentioned, we're now able to take snippets of museum skin from specimens and sequence them at costs that are reasonable, which allowed my students to learn new things about the relationships among these mammals. And as a final project, what they did was actually physically move specimens from one side of the hall to another side of the hall, where those relationships have been revised because of genetic data. The next example that I want to give, so this is really an example of how the cost of technology has really enabled new teaching methods. The next thing, the final example I want to give is, again, very simple and has to do with the way that we teach graduate students. In the sciences, one of the ways graduate students really learn new research material is to have a journal club, which usually means we all read a paper a few days beforehand. We sit in a room and we talk about the paper. And we guess things like why the researchers did their experiments in certain ways, why they didn't do other experiments, what the next experiments might be. But wouldn't it be great if you could have that conversation with the researchers who actually did the experiments, and instead of guessing why they did things in one way or another, you could actually ask them. So what we decided to do was exactly that. And instead of flying researchers out to attend our journal clubs or our graduate seminars, we contact them on Skype. So they're able to sit in their office and tell us about their research. There's two benefits of this. Is one, the students come very prepared because they want to be able to ask intelligent questions to prominent figures in the field. And the second thing is we actually get to learn not just about the research itself, but the research process. And we learn all the things that didn't go right in the experiments that aren't reported in the papers, all of the serendipitous turns that research has taken. So with these two very simple examples, I just wanted to highlight how technology is changing, at least in a very small way, the work we're doing in the lab. So with that, I just wanted to end with some final questions that I hope will stimulate some discussion. And that is, in 25 years, what environment do we want to be teaching in and learning in? And what is the role of the university in that? Thank you.
Well, we've heard a lot about the benefits of collaboration and how it stimulates creative thinking. And so I'm going to throw out a question to this wonderful group of collaborating minds and ask you what is maybe a sort of mid-range question in the spectrum of the price tags for advanced instrumentation, the $10 million question only. And I'd like to kick off our general discussion by asking you guys, what would be one thing in the FAS of 25 years that you would wish to see that we don't already have? And the answer cannot be Mac accessible lecterns.
He's a big equipment guy.
So I think that the interdisciplinary opportunities are very deep, and I think that the question of life in the universe, and admittedly this is, of course, the field I'm particularly interested in, is going to see some enormous advances. And so for me, I think that at that scale, one could really do something where you really enabled, you know, a physical space where people could be together, but also put real resources behind a shared database of all the literature and all the products that are being produced by that research. Usually people, you know, try to make those available individually on their own websites and so on. So what I'm saying is an integrated space, not just a physical space, but also an e-space for all those activities. And that this really could be a center for learning about, you know, the place of the Earth in the universe and so on. So that's something I very much would like to see developed. And to make it more specific, that would be really a lot of life sciences and physical sciences working together, and maybe even beyond that, to give us kind of the human perspective on the discoveries.
So that would tend to militate against the idea of keeping departmental divisions as they are. and
Yeah.
in favor of different kinds of physical spaces.
Right. I mean, I think that it's limiting us to have these disciplinary departments. Of course, there's a huge benefit to it, right? But I think that it does kind of make us very, there's a physical barrier to interacting with our colleagues in a deep way right now. So.
And that can probably be extended to teaching as well. I think there's collaborations associated with research, but also teaching. I mean, over the last few weeks, we've had these teaching workshops and so forth, and what's become very clear to me is that there's an incredible amount of innovative teaching going on, and the more that we can sort of come together and share that information with each other, obviously we'll all benefit from that.
I could even extend that to extra departmental ways to admit and train graduate students. This is a similar
Yeah.
issue. Can we have PhD programs that aren't linked to departments or specific programs? Could we train somebody across divisions, across schools, something that is much more flexible and outside the departmental system?
I agree with that, and I'll add to it the observation that I think the humanities have a huge catch-up game to play here. I mean, both of the things I talked about, digital humanities and world literature, really demand much more collaboration. I think I would like to see in 25 years humanists having labs of some kind or their own research groups in the way that it goes without saying in the natural sciences. I know that not everyone in the humanities wants to adapt to that model. There are a lot of people who still favor the old kind of individualistic research, and that's fine too, but I think there are so many more opportunities now for this kind of collaboration that I think the humanities need to be structured differently to allow, at least to allow that to happen much more often. And I think this would have extremely interesting results in humanities research. So I think, and would make it much more compatible, I think, the kinds of things you guys are doing.
I'm sure that the audience has lots of questions, and I know that we have a couple of mics going around. So if you would identify yourselves, we can get a mic over to you and open the floor.
Hi, I'm Robert Chu at Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement, and I've been a consultant and a university professor of computer science for some years. And the topic of open classrooms, open university, open courseware is very interesting that you just discussed. That was on my mind. And collaboratively with that, the whole emphasis on reducing costs of the education today, so that students don't leave with $200,000 or $300,000 alone. So, question basically is how to make the learning much more effective, collaboratively with decreasing the cost through more and more collaboration, as you've been talking about.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Does anybody have any thoughts?
Well, I do feel that what I would hope we might do with the very significant resources we do have is to focus more on immersing our students in the actual doing of research, if that's what they want to do, and to not be so focused on the lectures. And maybe what we're seeing is that a lot of the lecture work can be handled and more can be exported somehow or recorded. The lecture has, somehow the lecture has really survived over time, and we have to give a nod to that. But my point is that if you look at the way we train graduate students, and I have so much excitement about when we train those graduate students, and why we have this hugely different way in which we train undergraduates, where we just expect them to go to lectures and do homework assignments, and why don't we have 18-year-old students participating or even leading discoveries, given that, especially now, if the discoveries are really focused on public data sets, they don't need to work for years to build up their own data set. Why not get them in there? And probably we do a much better job recruiting them and recruiting more diverse group, frankly, into those sciences. So from my perspective, that's where I would like to see the focus shift. And maybe it's going to be enabled by some of what we can do with the lectures if we want to keep them.
I also think streamlining the lectures in such a way that material that things to engage students in that can only be done in sort of a lecture format, or that you need, you have these very large classes, whereas other things should be shuttled out of lectures that are not necessary in that particular forum. And I strongly agree with this idea. I think this is very true in sciences, that to engage students, you do need to bring them into the lab, have them do hands-on research. And I think the balance is going to be, you can one person can give a lecture to 600 students, but having 600 students in the lab is certainly not possible, especially when there's concerns about costs. And so I think finding that balance where you teach certain things, making really good decisions about what you teach in the lab and what you teach in the lecture, I think is going to be a first step forward.
In regard to Professor Charbonneau's lecture, I am reminded of two facts. One, during the early days of particle research, there were what were known as bubble chamber girls. They were looking at all the pictures taken from bubble chambers, and I believe they were the first usually to discover what the PI was looking for. Of course, there was never a question of getting credit for the work done. Then, of course, more recently, the matter of Jocelyn Bell, who discovered the early science of pulsars, entered into some sort of an issue about the fact that she was not recognized. Now, looking at the lecture of Professor Charbonneau, what I find remarkable is the statement that it may not be necessary to go through this classic education system because one could develop skills to detect the data and perhaps find some generalizations from it to discover the planets. It brings me the question of, would it then be possible to offshore, to exaggerate, okay, the analysis of the data in order to speed up the process of planet detection?
Well, we largely have done that, and that's with computers. There's a connection to the comment you started with. I just want to mention, of course, that at Harvard Computer, we had for a long time in astronomy a history of women who had physics degrees who were studying the spectra of stars and made all the initial discoveries about the compositions of stars and didn't receive credit for many decades. But your comment about, really what I was trying to do is be provocative and say that in the sciences, and it isn't just astronomy, there is this it's not a new thing. There's this real disconnect between how we educate our students and what we expect them to know and what we ask of them in general exams and the things they do from morning until night in the lab and the things that actually allow them to advance their work. And it isn't just, I was focusing on data, but the other skills are, of course, personnel management, grant writing, how to give a good talk. We don't teach any of that stuff. As much as we focus on this one particular aspect, which is the disciplinary aspect. So I was trying to be provocative in saying that, what is it? Why do we hold on to such a focus on the discipline? And maybe, of course, it would be a shame not to. I mean, maybe that's true. That's just what we're going to do. The students do something very specific and they make their discoveries, but the whole purpose is to put that in this broader scientific context, and that's why they have to have kind of 8 or 10 years of very detailed studies in physics or biology, whatever it is. But in terms of exporting the work, I think that the real innovation is how to use computers and have the person, figuring out how to use computers innovatively. And that's certainly something that needs to have much, much, much more focus in all the disciplines, not just science, going forward.
I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Okay, my name is Amador Muriel. I am visiting the philosophy department, where I try to do a little philosophy of science.
Peter Bull has a question.
So this is a question for Martin, but also I think for Maya. One of the things that I've been struck by, and this came up with Charbonneau's comments to begin with, is the extraordinary investment in the cyber infrastructure for the sciences. If you were to look down 25 years and suppose that there was going to be investment in cyber infrastructure for the humanities and social sciences, what would your priorities be?
I think, I mean, I'll jump in on this from the point of view of a historian. So one of the things that characterizes the work that I was trained to do is to travel, is to use archives, archival materials. Now, by definition, these are very rare materials that are housed in special places and different corners of the world. And for me, at least, part of the delight of doing archival research is precisely to go into these places and handle that material and be in the settings in which they're stored. That said, it requires an enormous amount of support and access and funding in order to let me do that. It means that only a handful of people are able to access these materials. And the great breakthrough that is beginning to transform this field is one that sees the digitization of those archival materials. Now, this has been a really uneven process because, again, money goes to the places that already have it. And so what we see is the digitization of materials in wealthy countries, in portions of the collections within those countries that have considerable philanthropic giving behind them, and so on. And so what I would like to see an institution like Harvard do is extend its commitment to the university for the world in trying to distribute its resources and making available resources in other parts of the world that maybe aren't as well endowed, that helps create, if you will, a kind of digital archive of the world that could then be accessed by people here and elsewhere.
So to add to that, so I think creating the digitization in the first place, crucial, and it's uneven right now, as you described. The other, though, is the access, what happens with the access, and I think there, humanities scholars need much more help doing data mining and all of these things. We've not trained to do that. We're not even trained to think about projects that could use these new tools. So I think there needs to be much more of an interface between, and some people like scholars like Franco Moretti at Stanford have begun to do that with really fantastic results, I think. So I do think that's one way of doing it. But as I said earlier, equally important, I think, is the social organization of research in the humanities. And that's when we come back to collaborative research, labs for humanities, faculty, and so on and so forth. So there's, I think, a technical aspect. Well, there's the digitization. There's a kind of a training in those new tools and thinking about projects that allow these tools to be used effectively. And then there's the social organization of research. I think there may be more dimensions, but those three, I think, have to change together in some way.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm Judy Singer, the Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity, but I'm also a statistician. And what was really striking about every one of your presentations, including yours, Martin, is I've never been through a conversation for an hour and a half about data where the word statistics has not come up at all. And so I'm also struck that this week happens to be the 55th anniversary of the Harvard Statistics Department. It was founded on Valentine's Day 55 years ago. And so part of it, I think, speaks to this question of collaboration across disciplines and how we foster the kind of interchange between these data-rich fields from digital humanities to exoplanets and the resources in departments like the statistics department and obviously the computer science department. But that was said. The statistics department wasn't mentioned. And I think there's a real opportunity to get undergraduates engaged in being knowledgeable about statistics as a way of seeing the world through data, but also tying in the research of other faculty like yourselves to make statistics classes just a lot more engaging. When I used to say I was a doctoral student in statistics or I'm a statistics professor, the line was always, oh, I took a course in that once, I hated it. And now when you have all of these different fields calling data as one of the real challenges of the present, let alone FAS at 400, how can we think about that space and try to build those collaborations?
Well, this, of course, is a question that can go right back to Dean Smith in a variety of ways. But I think one of the great things that we discovered, even in the process of having our conversations behind the scenes, is in this digital age, it seems much easier to have different kinds of collaborations, and yet it actually makes it much more difficult to get people to sit down in the room together. And it's when you get the people in the room together that the ideas really begin to flow. I think your point also invites me to make another reflection on one of the themes that I think bound together the comments today, which is this disjuncture that we seem to be feeling between set of acquired skills and ways of thinking. And of course, I have just presented this as a disjuncture. There are certain ways in which learning how to pipette, for example, is maybe not what your students in front of their computers are doing anymore. But of course, skills and modes of thinking do in some ways go together. And you point, I think, in your remarks about statistics to an area in which there are ways people can learn on the humanities side, among others, at how to deal with data that we can then import into our thinking. I think I see our time has run out actually, and I think that this might be a good note on which to wrap up a conversation that I think has thrown out a lot of really great questions about the future of collaboration and how we can create a university built and shaped around that as we move forward to 25 years, and also to use this to invite you thus to come back to the next session of this conversation series on March 7th in this same room at 4 o'clock with a different cast of all-stars, when we'll actually talk about some of the ways that we can create the new sorts of classrooms so that we can retain the sorts of collaborations that are so important to us and the kind of research that we do as we move forward. So with this, let me thank again, the collaborators of the day for throwing out lots of new ways of thinking, if maybe not new skills, at the computer podium. And please join me in thanking them for their presentation.